The bells of London rang with unrestrained joy that October morning, their peals soaring above the rooftops and spilling into every alleyway, every market, every church. At last, England had its long-awaited prince. In taverns, men raised their cups. In churches, candles flared. At court, courtiers smiled with the sly satisfaction of those who believe the future has just been secured. Edward, son of Henry VIII, and Jane Seymour, heir to the Tudor dynasty, had been born. But far from the cheering crowds in the shadowed chambers of Hampton Court Palace, the woman who had given him life was dying. The air in her rooms was heavy with the metallic tang of blood, the sour bite of fever. Her skin was pale and slick with sweat, her breaths shallow and ragged. Each movement seemed to pull her further from the world, each heartbeat a step closer to the abyss. Jane Seymour had done what no wife of Henry had yet managed, what Catherine of Aragon could not, what Anne Boleyn had died trying to do. She had delivered the son who would secure the Tudor line. And yet, in that same moment of triumph, her own life was slipping quietly away. There was no royal physician who could stop it, no tenderness from the man she had married, no reprieve for the queen whose worth had been measured entirely in the contents of her womb. While the prince was swaddled in silks and paraded as England's salvation, Jane lay abandoned in her bed, her body failing under the weight of a victory that was never meant to be hers. Beyond her chamber doors, the world celebrated a birth. Within, a woman faced her death in silence. History would remember Jane Seymour as the queen who gave Henry his heir. But that is the lie carved into stone. The truth is darker. She was not cherished, nor even mourned. Not truly. She was useful until she was not. And when her body had given the king what he wanted, it was allowed to break. Part 1. The board is set. By the year 1536, the English court was a gilded slaughterhouse. The air itself seemed to hum with suspicion, ambition, and the rustle of silks hiding sharpened knives. Beneath the painted ceilings of Whitehall and Hampton Court, men played their political games with the ease of seasoned predators. And women, whether noble-born or mere attendants, lived under the unspoken law that their survival depended on the fruit of their wombs. King Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of Christendom, had become a man consumed by a single, gnawing obsession: a son. His reign had been shaped, twisted, and nearly broken by the absence of one. A decade with Catherine of Aragon had yielded him only a single living child, the Princess Mary. And in Henry's eyes, a daughter was not the cornerstone of a dynasty, but a chink in its armor. Catherine, loyal, proud, and once beloved, was cast aside after 20 years of marriage. She was exiled from court, stripped of her titles, and left to die in damp, lonely rooms, her heart broken long before her body followed. Her replacement, Anne Boleyn, had been fire where Catherine was stone. Clever, magnetic, and unafraid to match Henry's temper with her own, she had promised him the future in the form of sons. But after one living daughter and a series of miscarriages, her crown became a target. In the spring of 1536, Anne's head fell to a French sword on Tower Green, her body buried in an unmarked grave within the tower's cold walls. The pattern was set. A queen's crown was not made of gold, but of glass, and when it cracked, it shattered in blood. The women of the court understood this as well as they understood their prayers. They smiled, they curtsied, and they hid their terror behind jeweled masks. It was into this treacherous theater that Jane Seymour stepped. On the surface, Jane was no one's idea of a royal temptress. Her complexion was pale as fresh parchment, her hair a muted gold, her manner soft, almost self-effacing. In a court that prized wit and sparkle, she was quiet, almost forgettable, an unpolished pearl in a sea of gemstones. But in that plainness lay her advantage. She radiated safety in a place where beauty could be lethal, and men, especially Henry, found in her an image of the obedient, traditional wife they had been taught to worship. Her family saw it too. The Seymours of Wiltshire were not blind to the tides of fortune. Edward Seymour, calculating and steady, and Thomas Seymour, charming and reckless, understood that their sister's unthreatening demeanor was a weapon far sharper than Anne's quick tongue had ever been. They had watched the Boleyn family soar to dizzying heights, only to crash headlong into disgrace and death. They would not make the same mistakes. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Place Jane in Anne's household, close enough to learn the Queen's habits, sharp enough to notice her errors. Let her observe how pride can be mistaken for defiance, how intellect can be wielded like a dagger, and how easily both can draw the king's wrath. Jane learned quickly. She saw that Anne's brilliance had dazzled Henry once, but now it irritated him. So Jane became her opposite. Where Anne debated, Jane agreed. Where Anne displayed her learning, Jane spoke of devotion. Where Anne sought to influence politics, Jane confined her ambitions to the household and the chapel. Every gesture, every word was a careful stitch in the veil of modesty she wore before the king. And in the great game of Tudor survival, Jane Seymour's first move was not to charm Henry, but to make him believe she was incapable of trying. Part 2. The Courtship of a Predator. It began quietly, almost invisibly. A glance across the great hall, a lingering look during a formal audience, the king's voice softening when he addressed her. Henry VIII, who had once roared with laughter and slammed goblets on the table in the presence of Anne Boleyn, now lowered his tone for Jane Seymour, as if she were something fragile, something to be handled with care. But fragility in Henry's court was an illusion, and Jane understood it. Her brothers understood it too. Edward, the strategist, knew that the first touch could not be hers. Thomas, the charmer, knew that hunger grew sharpest in denial. They coached her carefully. Do not reach for the king. Do not encourage him too openly. Let him chase you. Let him imagine you are virtuous enough to refuse him, even if you intend no such thing. Jane obeyed. When Henry pressed a jeweled gift into her hand, she returned it untouched, murmuring that she had no wish to dishonor her family or her queen. When he lingered in conversation, she cast her eyes down, letting her silence speak of modesty rather than calculation. She was the image of restraint, and Henry, accustomed to women who fought for his favor, found the resistance intoxicating. By the early months of 1536, the king's visits to Anne Boleyn's chambers had grown shorter, his temper with her sharper. In contrast, he began calling for Jane, inviting her to ride with him, to walk in the gardens, to play cards in the quiet of the evening. Officially, she remained a lady-in-waiting to the queen. Unofficially, she was already something more, an answer to a question Henry had been asking since his youth. Who will give me my son? It was a dangerous game, for everyone could see what was happening. The court began to shift around her like a living thing sensing the approach of prey and predator locked in the same hunt. Some ladies whispered prayers for Jane's safety. Others sharpened their smiles, eager to attach themselves to her if she rose. Foreign ambassadors watched with careful eyes, writing coded letters home that spoke of a new star in the king's firmament and predicting the swift fall of the current queen. And Anne Boleyn, trapped in the tightening noose of her husband's waning affection, recognized the danger too late. She saw Jane's quiet deference for what it was, a mirror held up to her own defiance. And in that reflection, Henry saw the woman he wished he had married from the start. By spring, the courtship was no longer whispered. Jane was moved into more prominent rooms. She was summoned more often, dressed more richly, and placed deliberately in the king's path. It was not love. Henry's affections were a currency, and Jane had become the most valuable investment in the realm. In May of that year, Anne Boleyn's fate was sealed. Trumped-up charges of adultery and treason, crimes no one dared doubt publicly, were enough to send her to the scaffold. On May 19th, her head fell to the French swordsman's blade 11 days later. In the hushed chambers of Whitehall Palace, Henry married Jane Seymour. The court called it a wedding. The more honest among them knew it was the coronation of the king's new hope. Jane, pale and trembling beneath her veil, must have known it too. The crown was not a prize, it was a target, and she was stepping directly into the line of fire. Part 3. A pregnancy in a gilded cage. The announcement came in the chill of early 1537, carried on a wave of whispered prayers and sharpened expectations. The Queen was with child. It was the news Henry VIII had hungered for, the promise that the bloodline of the Tudors might finally be secured. But for Jane Seymour, it was not so much a blessing as a sentence. From the moment the words left the lips of the royal physicians, she ceased to be a woman in the eyes of the court. She became a vessel, an ornate, heavily guarded reliquary containing England's future. The rules of her existence changed overnight. Every meal was planned with the precision of a military campaign. Every morsel she ate was approved by physicians who feared not the wrath of God, but the wrath of the king should anything go wrong. Her walks in the gardens were shortened, then forbidden. Her household swelled with midwives, attendants, and watchers whose eyes never left her, not out of love, but out of terror for their own lives if she failed. Henry's mood swung like a pendulum. Some days he arrived in her chambers smiling, promising her palaces, jewels, and eternal devotion, so long as she gave him a son. On other days, he paced the corridors outside her rooms like a restless predator, issuing orders, interrogating physicians, and snapping at servants as though sheer force of will could dictate the child's sex. Superstition wrapped itself around the pregnancy like a second skin. Jane was forbidden to look at the sick or the deformed, lest the sight mark the child. She was told to pray constantly, for her spiritual purity was considered as critical as her physical health. Royal astrologers cast daily horoscopes, combing the heavens for signs of a prince while quietly drafting explanations should disaster strike. The palace itself became a kind of shrine to the unborn heir. Ministers spoke less of matters of state and more of omens, dreams, and the queen's complexion. Courtiers vied for a place near her, hoping that proximity to the womb that might save the dynasty would one day yield political profit. And yet, beneath the silks and ceremonies, fear coiled tighter with each passing month. Henry had known loss before: stillbirths, miscarriages, infants who lived only days. And every shadow in Jane's eyes, every cough, every moment of fatigue was enough to set off a chain of panic among her keepers. The choice of Hampton Court Palace for the birth was no accident. It had been expanded and modernized to serve as the perfect royal birthing chamber, warm, isolated, and outfitted with the finest furnishings money could buy. But its walls carried darker whispers. It was here Henry had honeymooned with Anne Boleyn. Here he had begun to dream of her downfall. In her final weeks of pregnancy, Jane became a ghost in her own palace. Her cheeks hollowed, her voice grew quieter, and she seemed to shrink into herself. Even her smiles, when she managed them, were thin, fleeting things, as if she knew what everyone else refused to say aloud, that bringing a Tudor prince into the world was as likely to kill her as it was to secure her place beside the king. And in the silent corridors beyond her chamber doors, bets were being placed, not on whether the child would live, but on whether Jane Seymour would survive long enough to see him grow. Part 4. 3 Days of Hell. The first pains came on the night of October 9, 1537. At first, they were manageable. Sharp tugs deep in her belly, the kind any expectant mother would recognize. But Jane Seymour knew better than most that childbirth was not simply the act of bringing life into the world. In the Tudor court, it was a battlefield. The enemy was invisible, the outcome uncertain, and the cost could be everything. By dawn, the corridors of Hampton Court were humming with restrained urgency. Servants darted like shadows, fetching bowls of water, clean linens, and whispered prayers. The great lords of the realm paced in nearby chambers, their conversations clipped, their ears tuned for the one cry that would decide the fate of England. Henry the Faith was nowhere near her bedside. He walked the palace halls like a general before a siege, demanding updates from physicians and snapping at attendants who failed to give him certainty. He wanted a son, alive and strong. How Jane fared in delivering him was a secondary matter. As the hours stretched into the second day, the birth chamber became a theater of medieval medicine and desperate superstition. The air was thick, cloying with the smell of sweat, blood, and burning herbs meant to purify the room. Midwives murmured invocations between instructions, crossing themselves as they worked. The problem was clear to them, though none dared speak it aloud to the king. The child was not coming easily. A breech presentation, the midwives would call it now. A position that made every push a tearing agony, every contraction a gamble between life and death. Jane screamed until her voice was ragged, her cries carrying down the halls, unsettling even the most hardened courtiers. Priests were summoned more than once to administer last rites, only for her to rally, teeth clenched, hands gripping the bedclothes as though she could claw her way back from the brink by sheer will. Meanwhile, the palace outside her chamber door was frozen in a strange, tense limbo. Some prayed, others plotted. Foreign ambassadors wrote in cipher to their kings, unsure whether they would report the dawn of a new Tudor era or the double funeral of queen and child. By the third day, the agony had hollowed her out. Sweat pooled in the hollows of her collarbones. Her hair clung to her face. Every muscle in her body shook from exhaustion. And still, the midwives coaxed, commanded, begged her to push. Then, at last, a cry. Thin at first, then swelling into a lusty wail. It was a boy. Edward, the Prince of Wales. Relief surged through the palace like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Bells were ordered to ring in London, cannon to fire in salute. Henry, beaming with triumph, paraded the news before the court as if England itself had been reborn. But in the birth chamber, the victory was already turning hollow. Jane was pale, too pale. The prolonged labor had ravaged her, tearing her internally, leaving her bleeding in a slow, unstoppable tide. Physicians swarmed her bed, applying poultices, binding cloths, muttering over bowls of bitter-smelling herbs. None of it could undo the damage. The prince was whisked away to safety. The queen lay still, her breaths shallow, her skin clammy and cool. The celebrations had begun. But for Jane Seymour, the real battle was only just beginning, and it was one she was already losing. Part 5. The Shadow. Over the christening. The morning after Edward's birth, the air at Hampton Court was thick with the smell of roasting meats, beeswax candles, and the chatter of courtiers rehearsing congratulations. England had its prince, and the palace intended to celebrate as though the future itself had been secured. But in the Queen's chambers, the air was different, damp with fever, heavy with the sour scent of sweat and blood. Jane Seymour lay propped against pillows, her face chalk white, her lips cracked. Her body, ravaged by 3 days of torment, was sliding into a slow and irreversible decline. At first, there was hope. On the second day after the birth, she sat upright long enough to hold her son. Witnesses swore she smiled, and perhaps she did, though the expression looked more like relief than joy. In that moment, she had fulfilled her duty. She had given Henry his heir. She had survived, or so everyone wanted to believe. But fever is a quiet predator. It does not strike in fanfare, but in whispers. By the 5th day, the warmth in her skin had become a burning heat. Her abdomen throbbed with an agony she could barely name. She shivered beneath layers of blankets, teeth chattering even as sweat soaked her nightgown. The royal physicians, bound more by fear of the king than by the limits of their craft, responded with the blunt instruments of Tudor medicine, bloodletting to balance the humors, purgatives to cleanse the body, poultices of foul-smelling herbs. Each treatment weakened her further, feeding the infection instead of starving it. What modern medicine would recognize as puerperal sepsis, the deadly result of unsanitary hands and torn flesh, was to them nothing more than a temporary imbalance to be corrected by superstition and guesswork. Outside her rooms, Henry VIII moved in a different world. Preparations for the prince's christening filled his days. The order of procession, the guests of honor, the fabrics for the ceremonial robes. He spoke with ministers about alliances this heir might one day forge, about the treaties his very existence would secure. When courtiers brought news of Jane's worsening condition, the king waved it away. Queens had died in childbirth before, he said. It was a risk God himself allowed for the sake of dynasties. The prince was what mattered now. On October 15th, the christening unfolded in a blaze of pageantry. The chapel was lit with hundreds of candles. The prince, swaddled in cloth of gold, was carried through the aisles like a relic. Trumpets announced his arrival. Choirs lifted their voices in song. Every bow, every word, every note of music was a hymn to the newborn's future reign. And yet, the one person who had made it possible was nowhere to be seen. Jane lay in her chamber, feverish and drifting in and out of delirium, too weak to attend the ceremony that celebrated her ultimate triumph. 3 days later, in the pale hours before dawn, her body finally surrendered. Surrounded only by her ladies-in-waiting, no king, no fanfare, Jane Seymour took her last breath. When the news reached Henry, there was no public scene, no shattering grief. Witnesses recorded only mild irritation, as if the Queen's death were a poorly timed inconvenience in the schedule of royal affairs. The bells that had rung so joyfully 12 days earlier for the birth of England's prince now tolled for his mother, but in the echo of their sound was a truth no one dared speak. Jane Seymour had been celebrated only for what she could give, and once she had given it, she was allowed to die. Part 6. From Woman to Myth. In life, Jane Seymour had been quiet, cautious, and, above all, aware of the fragility of her position. In death, she became something else entirely. The Tudor court moved quickly to decide how she would be remembered. There would be no lingering on the details of her illness, no discussion of the 3 days of torment that had torn her body apart, no mention of the fever that had devoured her from within. Instead, a cleaner story was written. Jane Seymour, the perfect queen, the holy mother who gave her life so England might have its prince. Henry VIII was the first to shape the narrative. To the public, he called her his true wife, the one who had loved him purely, the one who had given him his greatest gift. This, from the man who had spent her final days consumed with christening plans and diplomatic calculations. The reality that she had been abandoned in the very hours she most needed him was quietly scrubbed away. Painters were commissioned to immortalize her, not as she had been, pale, trembling, afraid, but as the Tudors wanted her to be, serene, radiant, hands folded over a womb that had fulfilled its sacred duty. These portraits became icons, their stillness masking the violence of her end. Chroniclers, too, bent their pens to the king's will. Under royal patronage, they crafted accounts that praised her humility, her piety, her supposed willingness to die for England's future. She was recast as the antidote to Catherine of Aragon's stubborn pride and Anne Boleyn's dangerous wit, a woman who had known her place and embraced it until the end. The transformation served many purposes. For Henry, it was a way to frame himself as the devoted husband whose grief was pure, rather than the calculating monarch who had already begun contemplating his next marriage before Jane's body was cold. For the Protestant reformers at court, it was an opportunity to claim her as a martyr for their cause, a queen whose sacrifice marked divine approval of England's break from Rome. And for the court itself, it was a way to ensure that Jane's death left no dangerous questions. If she was a willing martyr, then no one had to answer for the primitive medical practices, the isolation, or the cold political calculus that had sealed her fate. The truth was more dangerous than any scandal. To admit that Jane Seymour had been allowed to die, perhaps even expected to, once she had produced an heir, would have been to expose the machinery of Tudor power for what it was, a system that valued women only for their utility and discarded them the moment that utility was spent. So her story was embalmed in myth, as carefully preserved as the silks that wrapped her body in its tomb at Windsor. Visitors to the chapel would see her effigy, carved in stone, lying beside the husband who had so efficiently erased her reality. They would read the inscription praising her virtue and sacrifice, never knowing the price she had truly paid. In time, the woman disappeared entirely, replaced by the symbol. Jane Seymour, daughter, sister, queen, mother, was gone. In her place stood the immaculate Tudor Madonna, silent, obedient, and eternally grateful for the privilege of dying in childbirth. It was, in its way, the perfect ending for Henry's perfect wife. Part 7. The Legacy of a Manufactured Saint. Edward, the boy for whom Jane Seymour had given her life, grew up under the weight of a truth no one dared speak aloud. His very existence had killed his mother. The court, of course, wrapped that fact in softer language. They told him she had given herself willingly, that her death was a noble sacrifice ordained by God. Protestant reformers whispered that she had died as a martyr to the Reformed faith, her passing a divine blessing upon England's break from Rome. But Edward was an intelligent child, and the shadows in those words were not lost on him. From his earliest years, he carried himself with an unnatural seriousness. Witnesses remarked on how he rarely laughed, how his devotion to religion bordered on obsession. It was as if he were trying in every prayer to justify the cost of his life. His reign, brief and marked by unyielding Protestant zeal, would bear the stamp of that inherited guilt. For Jane's family, her death was both a wound and a stepping stone. The Seymour brothers, Edward and Thomas, rose to prominence during Edward VI's minority, leveraging their status as uncles to the king. Yet the very ambition that had placed Jane in Henry's path now consumed them. Court rivalries, factional struggles, and personal miscalculations led both brothers to the scaffold within a decade. Proof that Jane's success had poisoned her bloodline as surely as it had secured the throne. In the wider world, the myth of Jane Seymour endured, its edges smoothed by time. Victorian writers romanticized her as the gentle antidote to the dangerous Anne Boleyn, a model of wifely obedience and maternal devotion. Painters wrapped her in halos of soft light, her hands forever folded in prayer, her gaze serene. In films and novels, she became the good wife, the one Henry truly loved, because she had given him what he wanted and asked for nothing in return. The reality that she had been a political pawn, that her death was preventable, that her martyrdom was constructed to absolve the king and flatter the dynasty, was buried so deeply that even scholars repeated the propaganda. And so Jane's legacy was not her son, who died childless at 15, nor her family, who destroyed themselves in the scramble for power. Her true legacy was the template her story provided, how to turn a woman's suffering into a parable of virtue, how to erase her agency and her pain in service to a narrative that glorifies male ambition. In the centuries since her death, countless women, royal and otherwise, have been remembered in the same way, not as people, but as symbols, not for who they were, but for what they gave. Jane Seymour's life and death taught those in power that this erasure could be done neatly, efficiently, and most dangerously, convincingly. 500 years later, the bells still ring for Edward's birth in the pages of history books. But if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear another sound beneath them. The fading heartbeat of a woman whose story was rewritten before her body was cold.